Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start by setting the stage for our next discussion. Commercial operators view spectrum as key to meeting the exploding demand for wireless data. Federal agencies view spectrum as a strategic asset, critical to mission success. We just heard from Deputy CTO Bonner. The administration is working on a national spectrum strategy to find balance in the turbulence. The objective of our panel is to assess what that plan will mean for industry and for US leadership writ large. To do that, we have lined up some of the sharpest minds in spectrum, all of whom I'm privileged to call friends. Starting to my immediate left, we have Adriana Welton, who heads legal and government affairs at UScellular. We have Will Johnson, who heads regulatory and legal affairs at Verizon. Joel Taubenblatt, of course, chief of the FCC's Wireless Bureau. Sean Spivey, senior policy advisor at NTIA. And Barbara Baffer, VP of Government and Public Advocacy at Ericsson. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Sean, I'd like to ask you to kick us off. You are holding the pen on the National Spectrum Strategy. That's exciting. It's an opportunity to think imaginatively about what the country can achieve. You're about 6 months in. What have you learned? And are you seeing this whole of government effort that the administration is seeking? Are you seeing that materialize, or are you finding agencies digging in and entrenching themselves and making the job harder?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Umair. Thank you to CTIA. It's good to see so many friends and former colleagues, current colleagues out in the audience. It's funny, you said 6 months, and some days it feels like 6 days, and some days it feels like 6 years. So, but 6 months, yeah, I've been at NTIA for about that long, though I should note Joel is still technically my boss at the commission. We can get into that later. But no, it has been a great experience working with a whole team of people at NTIA on the development of the National Spectrum Strategy with Scott Harris leading the helm, and you'll hear from him a little bit later in the day. So I've learned a couple of things in my time working on the strategy. The first is that just the breadth and depth of spectrum-based services. So I worked in the private sector, I worked at the commission, I worked at NTIA. Before taking this job, I spent a couple of years working on the national broadband map, so I'd stepped away from spectrum a little bit. But I thought coming in that I had a pretty well-rounded idea of the spectrum ecosystem, and I was just seeing, I think, the top of the iceberg. There are so many use cases. Obviously, there are the terrestrial-based wireless networks that the people in this room are working to deploy and support, and they support so many industry verticals. There's connectivity in the unlicensed space. There's space-based services, with satellite imagery, a whole ISAM industry that's being stood up in terms of in-space assembly and manufacturing. And that is before we even get into the untold number of federal missions that are supported by spectrum-based systems. So the first was just really getting a nosedive, mile-deep education into all the different types of systems that are out there. And I think Austin's boss has been quoted as saying, with all due respect to Dunkin' Donuts, that America runs on spectrum. So, and I think that's absolutely true today. It's truer today than it's ever been. The second thing that I've learned is that process is policy. And what I mean by that is I think it's no secret that in recent history, spectrum issues have spilled out into the public, into some pretty unusual fora. And I think, what we need is a process that kind of allows for early and often engagement among all stakeholders with transparency to the maximum extent possible, and recognizing that that's not always possible because sometimes you're dealing with sensitive or even classified data, but bringing people to the table early, subject matter experts, so they can discuss and engage in an evidence-based way is really important. The third thing is we're really at a fulcrum, I think, of spectrum management technologies. We've planted all these seeds that are starting to grow in terms of spectrum access systems and environmental sensing capabilities and the CBRS band, AFCs and the 6 gigahertz band. We're talking about incumbent informing capabilities at NTIA and other kind of dynamic spectrum management systems. And I think that it's going to be critical that we continue to work in collaboration with all stakeholders to advance research in those very important technologies that are going to help us better manage the spectrum resource going forward. So in terms of challenges, I think I will say that the agencies, we are working very well with the agencies through an interagency collaborative process. I feel very good about where we are with that. Everyone recognizes that it is a national priority that we make more spectrum available for all users, both federal and non-federal. I think we view spectrum access for the commercial sector and the economic prosperity that brings as national security, right? They're kind of all tied together. And so we're trying to work collaboratively with our agency partners to find ways that we can kind of move the ball forward in this new world. And the last thing I'll say is that I think is important is trust. We have to trust one another, right? We have to trust that you are coming to the table in good faith and that we are coming to the table in good faith and that everyone is working to try and find solutions to our very complex problems. And so, we're trying to think of ways that we can build trust because trust is not given, it's earned. And, I think we have to think of things like greater transparency where possible, more direct, open collaboration, and, other ideas that we can get from members of the public and from our partners on how we can continue to collaborate in a collaborative fashion.
That's great. A lot of optimism from Sean. Joel, what about the FCC? Deputy Bonner recognized the administration's not writing on a blank page. The FCC's got a lot of proceedings underway, 6, 12, 13 gigahertz, inquiries on receiver performance, spectrum utilization, plans for commercial space launch. How does the national spectrum strategy impact the FCC's work and priorities going forward? And do you need that strategy to be successful on this agenda that's underway?
Yeah, thank you, Umair, and thank you to CTIA for having me. It's also good to see everybody out here. So at the FCC, we do think that long-term spectrum planning is very important and also will play a very critical role. And we look forward to working with NTIA and with the federal agencies as we look to identify additional bands for future use. And it is that long-term planning combined with near-term action that we think really is going to maintain the U.S. leadership in terms of the wireless economy, which we think is critical for both the nation's economic security as well as our national security. And so at the FCC, we look forward to continuing to work hard on the proceedings that we have pending before us. As you mentioned, Umair, just last week, the Commission adopted an allocation and a licensing framework for spectrum for commercial space launches, which is a very big growing industry. We continue to work to build upon the efforts that we've had in 6 gigahertz to promote unlicensed innovation, and particularly are working with respect to very low-powered devices. We continue to work towards making available the upper 12 gigahertz band, 12.7 to 13.25, working towards that. We are working hard towards service rules for supplemental coverage in space, promoting innovative collaborations between satellite operators and terrestrial mobile operators to expand coverage to all consumers, particularly those in rural areas or remote areas where it's becoming even more important. We continue to work hard on service rules for UAS, drones in the 5 gigahertz band, and looking forward to working collaboratively with our colleagues in other federal agencies. And we also are working to develop a record on how to better understand spectrum utilization and some of the tools that Sean mentioned and where the technology is taking us and how that will lead us as we head towards our wireless future.
Adriana, you've got a lot of experience engaging with the FCC when it comes to their proceedings. What's it been like to engage with the administration and with NTIA on a national spectrum strategy? Does industry have a seat at the table? Is there room for improvement in those processes?
Thank you, and thanks again for having me. Good to see everybody here, too. I think what Sean said can be felt on our side of the aisle, too. There is an emphasis on cooperation, collaboration, understanding, and problem-solving issues as they arise through a series of different activities, right? Whether it's the listening tables or the NPRM, which was more expansive than I think that we thought it was going to be initially, and gave us an opportunity to comment on the practical and technical difficulties of some of the things that are on the table, like network sharing, right? Where has it worked? Where hasn't it worked, right? Like Open RAN, what are we seeing? What haven't we seen? And that willingness to engage in a transparent and technical evidence-based discussion. I think from our interactions, but to be clear for the rest of the group, that is being felt, right? So that feels like very good, thoughtful progress. And the coordination between the agencies, we can see the effort going in behind, obviously. There are a lot of different things to unpack, right? And I think it's that collaboration that we're looking forward to seeing how it translates into solving these very difficult questions around spectrum. I think you heard this morning general consensus around 1,500 megahertz being put out, and we need a strategy. I think where we have failed to kind of come together is with respect to, well, what does that mean, and how are we going to most effectively compete against economies like China that are already putting 2 times the amount of mid-band spectrum available in their markets, and where they've just made an announcement that makes that even more, right? 70% more capacity in mid-band in China today. That amplifies by 2027 to 160%. That is both as a wireless company something of a concern. How do we compete in the global sphere? But it is also as a citizen, right, and as a member of the U.S., how do we think about this so that we put ourselves back in a position where we can lead? And I think those difficult decisions and the approach that NTIA is taking that's more collaborative and technical will hopefully, get us the way there. We're excited to see your paper, Sean. So no pressure, from anybody in this group.
For the record, it is not my paper.
Zero anxiety in this room about what that paper is going to say, I think.
Well, sounds like those opportunities are there. Will, you got the lucky seat because I'm going to give you an opportunity here. You've got Sean, you've got Joel, you've got captive audience. What do you want to tell them about the strategy? Why is it important? What are the benefits of getting it right, the consequences of getting it wrong?
Sure. So thanks for having me. It's great to have an excuse to talk about something other than Title II today. So this is I'm happy to be here.
The panel's not over yet.
We're not going there. We already agreed. So your question on the stakes. So we think that the stakes here are extremely high. So again, no pressure. But we think that if we get this right, it can really put us on the path to maintain global leadership on wireless. And if we botch it, we might not even be able to keep our sort of growing demands from our customers, which are just skyrocketing all the time, as we know. So the visions of where this could lead us are dramatically different, and that's why it's so important to get it right. So we all know that spectrum is kind of the heart and soul of our industry. If we don't have the spectrum that we need over time, then things can sort of wither on the vine. And that has implications beyond just the consumer, not having the speeds they want, although that's super important. But it has broader implications for the economy and even for national security. So we really do have to get this right. So I'll start with maybe some good news. I was glad that Austin touched on it earlier, which is a recent success, wrapping up the C-band transition a few months ahead of schedule, which is super important. We all probably recall that the initial launch got off to a little bit of a dramatic start, but it ended in a fantastic place, so that's really exciting. Verizon are using C-band to reach 230 million customers, so that's just phenomenal, and using that spectrum to offer fixed wireless to 40 million homes. So it's really a game changer in terms of what you can do. So that's the good news. In terms of more concerns, when we look out a few years from now and think about what's sort of in the pipeline, that's a cause for concern right now. It's a little bit reminiscent of going to the grocery store and going to the bread aisle the night before a blizzard or something. There are a lot of question marks at the moment, and so that's a real opportunity for NTIA to help fill in and answer some of those questions in a useful way. If they do that right, I think there are probably 3 elements that they would really need to focus on. One, we think it's really important, given, again, some of the drama of recent years about interagency conflict and some of the things that have happened, that the spectrum strategy be super clear, that NTIA and the FCC really are the regulators. They're the folks in charge of spectrum policy for the administration and for the U.S. government. So I think that is really, really important, and hopefully it'll do that. Secondly, we hope that it will reiterate a commitment to the importance of full power licensed spectrum. I know there's a lot of interest and discussion about alternative models, and that's appropriate. But licensed full power really is sort of, again, the heart and soul of our industry, and is going to continue to be super important going forward. So we hope that it sort of reiterates that commitment in the spectrum strategy. And then the third part that I think is essential, and you already touched on this a little bit, is we know that the industry is going to need something like 1,500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum over the next 10 years. Don't need it all tomorrow, but we will need it over the next 10 years, and this stuff takes time and is complicated. So we hope that the strategy meets that goal and goes even beyond just sort of studying 1,500 megahertz, but actually identifies 1,500 megahertz that can be made available for licensed commercial use. So that's sort of the third element I'm hoping to see there. So if it does all those things, and we hope it will, then that could be sort of a catalyzing effect within the industry. It could help sort of coalesce focus among not just government regulators, but also federal users, wireless companies, vendors, and sort of the whole ecosystem. So we would really know what we have to work with over the next few years and could really be super helpful in that regard. If it is more of a weaker strategy that doesn't meet those three goals, then I do have some concerns, again, just about keeping up with the pace of what our consumers are going to demand. That would be certainly a bleaker future that we hope doesn't happen. But again, if that happens, not only are we going to have consumer issues, but you're going to have real impacts on the economy and even national security. So the stakes are super high.
You mentioned the growing demand, and I'll tell you, if you go into my office, there's only one thing hanging on the wall, and it's a chart. On the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is data use, and in the middle is a hockey stick, just showing exponential growth. Barbara, this is something Ericsson thinks about a lot. They've predicted fourfold increase in data usage by 2028. What do you see as the bands that potentially help us keep pace with the growth that Will is talking about?
Sure, and thanks for having me. This is the first time we've ever seen this room as standing room only. I mean, it's pretty impressive, so thanks for having me. So we have Ericsson Mobility Report that we put out every year, and we looked at different regions, but the US is by far, we used more data than anyone else. In 2021, it was about 14 megabits per subscriber. We predict by 2028 that it's going to be about 58 megabits per user. So it's really growing fourfold, like you said. We also predict by 2028, 90% of the US will be on 5G. So we really see the growth and the data in 5G. And then you think, gosh, what things can we do to try to use this spectrum more efficiently? So there's some technologies that we're looking at and using, some array antennas, some things like beamforming with massive MIMO, and we shouldn't forget, especially for today, that network slicing is also a way to really increase the spectrum with intelligent layer controller usage with the network slicing. So I think that that's really important, that we use every technology we can think of to use the spectrum more efficiently. Will, I like what you said about licensed spectrum. We think this is really important. We operate in 180 countries, so it's really important that you get economies of scale and equipment. Austin Bonner talked about today about diversity of suppliers. I think that's super important. Yesterday, we made some big announcements about Ericsson and Open RAN and Open Front Haul for Open RAN and leading Cloud RAN. So I think those are technologies that will also help us as well.
Thank you. Will, just coming back to you for a second, are there bands you would put on the table that we should focus on next?
Sure. I'd say in the sort of short to medium term, it's really important to keep a focus on mid-band. We all know that the combination of sort of capacity and coverage that provides has proven to be really, really important. We love our millimeter wave and we use it extensively, but when you're trying to reach broader areas, mid-band is really important. And so we do think that in terms of priority of focus, that needs to continue to be right at the top of the list for NTIA and FCC and others. If you want to think some particular bands there, I think we've been pretty public of the ones that we think have the most immediate promise. Lower 3 is certainly on the list, 4.4 to 4.9, and then also 7 and 8 gigahertz. Those are all probably the three that we've most focused on, but that may not be enough to get us all the way there. So I would start with those. I'd also just mention, I know we talk about mid-band, and it's sort of been an evolving or shifting definition of what that really means over time. So I just want to be real clear that when I'm talking about, as we were talking about 1,500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum, I really think in terms of future bands, you want to be, that sweet spot's kind of like that 3 to 8 gigahertz range. I mean, it's not that spectrum a little bit above or a little bit below that isn't certainly important, but in terms of priority of meeting those mid-band goals, I would really sort of focus there. And one other thing I would mention on mid-band, just almost as an aside, but it's important, is for all the work we did on C-band, which was super important, I want to flag that didn't cover Hawaii and Alaska. And so I don't think that's gotten the attention it deserves of figuring out what our mid-band solution is going to be for those two states. So I just wanted to flag that as well. So beyond mid-band, I would say that next up in terms of priority from our perspective would be following through on what the chairwoman has said about a potential, sometimes called an inventory auction. This is spectrum like some of the AWS-3 licenses that are really just sitting there at the FCC, and they could be put to use kind of right away for consumers. And so, I don't really love that tag inventory auction. That sort of sounds weird. So I think of it more as like a 5G ready spectrum or something, things that could really go right now and actually benefit consumers.
I wonder who came up with that inventory.
Did you guys message test that?
That name.
So we can figure out what to call it. But either way, we think that's sort of a low-hanging fruit that could really actually help consumers. Yeah. And then finally, obviously, we all want to eventually get to 6G, and we have to look a little further down the road. And so I know the chairwoman previously had sort of highlighted 7 to 16 as being important for 6G, and I think that's certainly a great range to be looking in for those developments. A lot of work still to go before we get there. There's, as you flagged earlier, the proceeding already underway on, I don't quite know if we're calling it upper 12 or 13 nowadays, but you know what I'm talking about. That will be important spectrum as well. We think that there's probably still a little more work to do in terms of the development there to figure out how to handle that one, although it will certainly be important spectrum going forward.
Okay, so near term I heard lower 3, I heard 4, I heard 7 and 8. So I'm going to try something here. I want to involve the audience in this question as well. Are we looking at the right bands here? So if you guys agree on that list, show some hands if you think that's the right list for what we should be looking at next.
To me. I don't know.
Round up, right?
So some hands there, Joel. From the FCC perspective, what you just saw, how are you viewing the spectrum needs for the commercial industry?
Yeah, I think from a policymaker's perspective, we definitely agree that there needs to be more of a domestic spectrum pipeline. It needs to be timely, and I think, as Will said, that the focus on mid-band, however one defines that, I think is going to be really critical as well. I think sort of conceptually for the FCC, I think we think of that spectrum pipeline as accomplishing a number of very important policy objectives. One, sort of foremost, is helping to facilitate deployment across the entire country for consumers, everyone, everywhere, and trying to get broadband service out to as many corners as we can. We think it's also really important to facilitate economic development and growth. We think it's also critical for the U.S. to maintain its leadership in global standards bodies so that we are aligning with allies around a common set of democratic principles and cybersecurity principles, which we think is really critical for the nation's security. And also, last but not least, we think a domestic spectrum pipeline really can promote research and development and innovation in this country, which we think is really important to be leveraged not just by the private sector, but by the public sector as well. It can really play an important role going forward.
So Adriana, your boss was recently in Aspen, gave a speech about another band, the 6 gigahertz band, suggesting we should take a fresh look there. So walk us through that.
Everybody else has been suspiciously quiet on 6G, although I was happy to see at the keynote this morning, our friends from GSMA are focused on 6 gigahertz too, right? Look, as a person, as a leader, one of the hardest things that we got to do is look back at decisions that were made with the best information available at the time, with everybody acting in good faith and thinking about the best way to move things forward. And to have to say the information in front of us has changed and we need to revisit that. We think this is one of those situations. When the decision was made to dedicate most of 6 gigahertz to unlicensed, it wasn't clear where China and the rest of the world was going to go for the next piece of the evolution of our global ecosystem on wireless. Well, now it's clear, right? Loud and clear, they're saying this is going to go to 6 gigahertz. And a lot of the rest of the world is following. I think Meredith said it this morning, right? The UK, Hong Kong, even places in South America are considering taking this battle. And so our intent is to reignite the conversation and to say, is this one of those difficult questions that is worth revisiting? Our opinion would be yes, because without harmonization for with the rest of the world, it is hard for us to lead in the same way that we did with LTE, right? You look at the example, our history in this industry is vast, and so we can look in hindsight to what's happened to other countries as they maybe have not prioritized the same level of speed to getting deployment out there, the same level of spectrum for capacity. And Europe is the use case for LTE, right? They fell behind, they lacked in competition, they lacked in economic development, they lacked in innovation. The last thing we want to do is see the US go down that path. Again, as a citizen, as a person in this world, we think that US leadership on this is key. Now we can think about, mid-band as beachfront property, right? Would 7, 8 gigahertz get that done? Maybe, but the harmonization piece would be missing, right? And I have had the benefit of working outside of this country in places where that harmonization with the US in its leadership position hasn't happened, and it is not a pretty picture. Ericsson has to decide, right, whether or not they're going to prioritize investment in scaling up and innovating the radios for 6 gigahertz or 7. If a lot of the rest of the world is on 6, and that's where the volume is going to be, that's going to be an easy priority from an economic decision as a company. And same for innovation. As you think about how do we open ourselves up to cyber attacks, things of that sort, right? The more we are the outlier, I think Meredith said, we can't be an island, right? The harder it becomes to do this well on a global level. So that's the conversation we're trying to spark. I want to say one thing to what Will said on 12 gigahertz, if I may. We, UScellular, most of you probably don't know our business model as well as you do some of the others, but we are highly focused on rural America and on connecting those that are hardest to connect. 41% of the population that we serve is rural. So that gives you a sense for where we are. And our scale is not as fast. When we think about 12, 13 gigahertz, it is twice as expensive for me to put a tower out in rural America today as it is on urban areas on any band. So let's call it the 3s, right? As I go up the band, it becomes, you double that for the 7 and 8s. And as you get to 12 and 13, you quadruple that. So think about that from a policy perspective as we're thinking about how do we get everybody connected. Those hardest to connect are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the most if we make transitions where it's a decision on the upper band only, right? And that's not just a complement to something else that's centered on this beachfront spectrum.
So Sean, what Adriana just said there was really, really interesting, right? She's talking about looking at what's happening globally and then taking a look back and seeing how can we make the most of the decisions that we've made. You're writing a strategy, which is an opportunity to look forward and think about how can the US be an international agenda setter. And we're getting ready to go into the World Radio Communication Conference. How do these things tie together? How does the strategy set us up at the conference? And what are the goals? What are the US goals for mobile and for spectrum at the World Radio Communication Conference?
Yeah, so I think we see them as complements, right? I mean, there are different goals and objectives for a domestic policy versus our international collaboration and our work, at CTIA and other places. But, we work hand in hand with our partners in developing the policies going into, those preparatory meetings. And so I would say a couple of things. I mean, first, I think we shouldn't give short shrift to the work that has been done by people in this room to make spectrum available, mid-band spectrum available in recent history, right? I mean, there was the work to clear the C-band, there was 180 megahertz. There's the ambit band at 3450, that's 100 megahertz. There's the 2.5 overlay licenses, which I know, as soon as Joel and his colleagues get auction authority, will be issued to the remaining licensees. So I mean, there has been work that has been done in preparation, right? I think that in terms of looking backwards, I mean, I believe the 6 gigahertz order, for example, was adopted by the Commission in April of 2020. I believe there were recons and maybe even litigation associated with that, though people would have to refresh my recollection from a couple of years ago. I do think that, one of the things we have to take into consideration is the investment-backed expectations that other people in the ecosystem have made looking back over 3 years now in terms of what's going to be available for their equipment development and getting certifications and other things. So it is a delicate balance. But I think that we had an open process where we heard from all stakeholders, and we understand that spectrum, and in particular mid-band spectrum, is going to be important to support this vital part of our national economy. And so we are going to work to find ways to make spectrum available. We're going to do that domestically where we can, and then we're going to work with our partners internationally where we can. I think the other thing that I would just say is, going into this WRC, and Austin talked about this a little bit, and she's a much better spokesperson for this than I would be, but I think you're seeing a lot of countries struggle with identifying bands for the next WRC, right? Like my understanding is Region 3, which includes Asia and all, parts of Asia and Australia, they are struggling to identify a band for future study. I think, there was a position going into CTEL, we didn't sign on to it, but we put forward, the 12 gigahertz band, I believe. So, I think that what you're seeing is in a growingly congested spectrum environment, not just in America, but throughout the world, these decisions are going to become more and more tough to make, and they're going to become harder, and that's why it becomes important that we think that, A, we institute a long-term planning process. People like to talk a lot about substance, and I understand why. Like, what bands are going to be in the national spectrum strategy? Obviously, that's important. I care a lot about it. Scott cares a lot about it. But I think process is really important because we're going to keep having these discussions, and we can't just, be reactionary. We have to have a process in place that leads to informed decision-making on the next set of bands for 6G or whatever the next G is. And so, we're trying to build in a long-term collaborative framework that will allow for engagement by all stakeholders, so that way we are making these decisions in the best informed way possible. And I think that's really important whether we're doing it domestically or internationally.
So there's some comfort in what you said there about the U.S. isn't the only one suffering from these problems. This is really a shared problem everywhere. The flip side of that coin, of course, is also that there seems to be an opportunity for the U.S. to take some real leadership on the global stage here. Barbara, Will, I'm going to invite both of you guys to weigh in on this. Do you think that the U.S. is well positioned to achieve the goals that Sean is talking about going into the World Radio Communication Conference?
I think we still have some challenges. I think we have to identify some spectrum bands for 6G. I mean, it's not easy, it's not fast, but I think we need to really, set our stakes down and try to identify what are we going to do on 6G, because we have researchers working on 6G now, and they have to look ahead many, many years to decide which bands, what is the world going to agree upon. So it's a big position. One other thing I wanted to mention is, on the 3 gigahertz band, because we talked a lot about it, the global standard on N77 covers 3,300 to 4,200, and that's right on top of the bands that I think the U.S. is taking a very careful look at. And so if you have 50 countries those are the bands that they've identified, that range, I think that gives us some good economies of scale, and I think that's where we really need to spend some focus time as well.
Yeah, I'll just say, at this point, I don't want to come off as negative, but I do have some real concerns here. I feel like traditionally the U.S. government has gone into these WRCs in a sort of position of real leadership and strength, and other countries look to us and sort of being forward-thinking about what those next bands are going to be, what the right approach is going to be to encourage the next G. And maybe we'll get there. Maybe we're just sort of at that sort of awkward phase before the WRC happens. I hope we get there, but I think that at least at the moment, it kind of feels like there are other countries that are being more aggressive, that are really positioning themselves, supporting a wide range of different bands for mobile terrestrial use, whereas at least how the process has played out here in the U.S. so far has been more reticence on some of those, raising concerns or suggesting limitations rather than really being forward-leaning in terms of teeing them up. So I am concerned about that. I hope we fix it. I think, again, back to an earlier question, I think the stakes of being a leader in this space are really, really high. As Adriana said, you want the benefits of international harmonization. That really matters in terms of economies of scale. It matters in terms of the U.S. being sort of the focus and the heart of the new developments, new innovation. We don't want some of other countries who may be adversaries of ours to really sort of become the hub for that influence and for that investment, for that innovation. We want it to be here. And so I think we don't want to find the U.S. a few years from now on an island where we've sort of done things on a bespoke way to address our domestic concerns, but didn't have an appropriate focus on really leading when it comes to WRC or other international events.
Joel, Barbara painted this picture about global progress on 3 gigahertz, and that looks like the near-term opportunity in the United States as well. We know DoD is finalizing their report as required by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act about what sharing opportunities are possible in that part of the band. What can you tell us about that report? Do you think that the FCC will get what it needs from that process in order to head toward auction as required by the law?
Yeah, so I mean, FCC staff has been attending those paths meetings along with colleagues from NTIA and DoD and industry, and I think there's been a lot of discussions around those. Obviously, the band is critically important. It's appeared on a lot of the wish lists here, and is sort of a natural progression to what we have out there already. And I think we're looking forward to seeing the report and continuing to work with DoD and NTIA to try to take next steps towards making it available.
Well, Barbara, one concern I know you and I have talked about is a concern that report will not fully address licensed opportunities in that band. Why is licensed access important there?
Well, it gives us certainty for we don't know what the sharing arrangements might be. There's a lot of different sharing discussions and types of sharing. When you have licensed exclusive use spectrum, you know what it's predictable, and also, it's more valued in the marketplace.
And Sean, this study process is somewhat of a first, the one that was spelled out in the IIJA, in that historically NTIA has played a pretty big role in how these studies are done. What does this mean for the future of spectrum studies?
So I think, as you pointed out, this was a bit of an outlier. It was a break from historical precedent. It was laid out in the statute how the process would work, and I don't think it was publicly reported at the time that there were even efforts by Secretary of Commerce Raimondo and Secretary of Defense Lloyd to write members of Congress to suggest maybe a change in the law to how that study process should work. So I don't know that I would read too much into how this particular study process was performed as to future studies. I do think there were lessons learned from this process, how people came to the table, how they positioned themselves and some of the positions they took, how parties were able to get access to sensitive and classified data. I think that there are going to be lessons learned that will potentially inform efforts going forward. That said, I think part of the strategy that we're trying to work on is getting back to regular order, and I've talked about it a little bit in terms of that long-term collaborative process. NTIA has a unique statutory responsibility as the President's principal advisor on telecommunications issues, also to ensure the most efficient use of spectrum resources across the federal government. FCC obviously is the sole regulator of non-federal spectrum use, so I think we want to ensure that we have the processes in place that recognize those unique statutory responsibilities of NTIA and the FCC going forward.
Well, Adriana, the lower 3 process eventually leads to an auction. Right now, the FCC doesn't have auction authority. Chairman Rosenworcel has said it's important that Congress renew it before we get to the World Radio Communication Conference. Do you agree? How important is it that the agency get auction authority back?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Right, we've been talking, and to Sean's point again, we've really felt the combination of different strategies that are coming to the table to try to get that more collaborative conversation, both across agencies as well as in our engagement with you. And so we expect that, right, to come out in a spectrum strategy that hopefully will lay out how we're going to move forward in a more consistent and kind of back to the ordinary course way of, hey, we have a plan and we're executing against it. And the vehicle for doing that is the FCC Spectrum Authority, right? Without that, we cannot execute on all this licensed spectrum that we've been talking about. And to Barbara's point, licensed is key to our ability to invest, right? This is an incredibly capitally intensive industry. You want us investing because if we invest in the pipes, then everything that comes on top of that will benefit everybody in society. But without that certainty and without the certainty that the FCC will be able to execute on that licensing of the spectrum, those decisions become much more difficult to make and risk us falling back. So absolutely critical.
Well, thank you for that. You know, Barbara had a great idea that we save a couple of minutes at the end for sort of a lightning round. Quick questions, we'll just go down the line. We've got a couple of minutes left here. First one, government shutdown, is it happening? Yes or no? What are the over-under on it?
Yes, it's happening.
Yes.
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 No comment.
Joel, you'll be working either way. So
I sincerely hope not, because we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
all right. Biggest challenge to spectrum policy in the United States?
Harmonization with the globe, to keep on my 6 gigahertz theme.
I'll flag 2. 1, to beat a dead horse, pipeline, having a robust pipeline, and then 2, avoiding sort of the rational exuberance over novel approaches and ignoring what's really worked for us, licensed spectrum.
Yeah, similar to that, I'd say demand for spectrum far outstripping the supply of spectrum right now, and need more time to fix it.
I would say our biggest challenge is also our biggest opportunity, and that is the pace of innovation in this country. I think we will need to get creative and find ways to innovate our way out of some of our problems.
I like that.
I'm ditto.
Yeah, it's great. Next band to prioritize after lower 3 gigahertz. Where do we go next?
Me. Yeah. But mid-band, right? I mean, obviously mid-band is where we need to be, beachfront property.
Yeah, ones I hit before, 7 and 8 in particular, 4.4.9, mid-band.
Yeah, mid-band.
Read the strategy when it comes out. I'll take Joel's no comment. I don't
Yeah,
Everyone gets
mid-band.
one. Everyone gets one, no comment. What's the most exciting use case we're going to be talking about next year?
Well, this year we're talking about fixed wireless, which has been awesome, right? 9 out of 10 new broadband connections are now on wireless, and that's something that everybody in this room has done. So that's pretty amazing. That's a big change from last year where we weren't quite sure how that was going to go. Next year, I don't know. I think that's the big question, right? The kind of huge use case for 5G isn't here yet. We don't have video in the way we had for LTE. So if I had my magic wand, I'd be making a lot more money someplace else in there. So.
Yeah, I'd say short term, 5G home, super excited about that. Longer term, I think the enterprise stuff is really cool. I would make a commercial pitch that go watch Kyle Milady, our CEO of our Verizon business group, who's giving a keynote tomorrow morning, talking about all the cool things that are happening on the enterprise side. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still very interested in self-driving cars and seeing where that ends up going. Self-healing networks and some of the effects and developments around AI, and I don't know, maybe self-running auctions. How about that? Actually, only the first 2.
In that case, maybe you won't be working.
So fixed wireless access is fantastic. My parents live in rural Southeast Texas, and that was a bridge network for them until very recent wireline deployment. So that's very cool. But I remember being at one of these a couple of years ago and seeing someone talking about like real-time translation. Like you'd be able to just wear an earpiece and speak to someone in a foreign language. And I've always wondered where that thing went. Like I would love to see that, but I don't know.
Will it interpret spectrum jargon?
Oh no, yeah, that's yeah.
We'd all be out of a job.
Far too
That's right, that's right.
So for 5G, big sports venues, Super Bowl, and for 6G, holograms.
Okay. All right, well, last question, Sean. I warned you I was going to ask you this in front of everyone. You've worked at the FCC, you've worked at NTIA. Remember, you've used your no comment, best place to work.
I mean, the federal government is a wonderful place to work.
Well, let's have a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, guys. That was amazing.